But we're very lucky to be joined by Miss Tina Cahalan Jones. Tina was born on an Army base during Vietnam War and has always had a heart for veterans. I believe you're talking to Bob over here, right, about your father's service, so thank you. And after graduating from Vassar College and the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health, she worked in Washington, D.C. for Congress. Also worked for a large nonprofit veteran service organization as a healthcare policy analyst. Jones earned her law degree from the University of Virginia and served as Associate General Counsel for Vanderbilt University. Jones has served on the board of the African American Heritage Society of Williamson County and Battleground Academy. In 2016, Jones founded the Slaves to Soldiers Project to recognize African American Civil War veterans in Williamson County. So thank you for all that you've done for this history, and thank you for being here today to share more about George Jordan.
Thank you, Scott and Miranda, for having me here today. Can everybody hear me okay? Am I holding it closer? Is that better? Okay. So yes, we're talking about Sergeant George Jordan. I know a lot of you have had a little introduction, and like Scott was just saying, names are important. Some of you probably just heard me say that. In Williamson County, if you were talking to a old timer in Williamson County, they would actually pronounce his name George Jordan. So, but I think it's become George Jordan today. And this is a picture of K Troop, which is like the equivalent of like a company in the 9th Cavalry during the Civil War. He is seated right down there in the front. Let me click forward real quick. That's him right there with the hat on. You can see he's wearing his Medal of Honor in that picture. Standing in the back row is Sergeant Henry Johnson, who also received a Medal of Honor. And as I'll get to in a minute, I think there's a third one hidden in this picture. This is Jordan's medal, and you can see, if you look closely, I don't know if you can see where it actually says the Congress to Sergeant George Jordan, Sergeant Troop K, 9th Cavalry. And it's just beautiful, like the script and everything. That's on the back of it. It's inscribed. So everyone would have been individually inscribed. So they're not, you can't sell them. They're non-transferable. This was his actual Medal of Honor. So let's just quickly go over what is the Medal of Honor. Like, I assume you probably already heard a lot about this, but it is awarded by the United States government, which is why it says it's from the Congress. It's bestowed upon service members who distinguish themselves through supreme valor, extraordinary courage, self-sacrifice above and beyond the call of duty while engaged in combat against an enemy force, as presented by the president in the name of Congress. And as I'm sure you already know, it was established during the Civil War, and the first one was awarded to a man for an incident related, like right outside of Chattanooga, which is why this center exists and why we're all here. So I want to talk just briefly about what we do know about Jordan's early life. Where was he from? What do we know? So he was from Williamson County, which is where I'm from, in Tennessee. It's right here in the middle of the state. Down there on the right, the little yellow arrow, that's where we are today. He was born in, we think, like 1847 in Williamson County. So what was happening at that point? Williamson County was one of 3 counties in Williamson County where 13 years later, when the Civil War began, 14 years later, more than half the people in Williamson County were African Americans and enslaved. There was only 3 counties with that much of a large percentage of enslaved people. So Jordan was, 1 out of every 2 people in Williamson County was a slave. That's what he grew up in. The year before he was born, the Mexican-American War had broken out. Texas had broken away as an independent country from Mexico a few years earlier. And then Mexico, under President James K. Polk, who was also from Tennessee, brought Tennessee in as a state. In 1846, there's a dispute over the border. America sends troops to the border. And that's one of the reasons Tennessee is called a volunteer state, because they asked for like 3,000 soldiers and like 30,000 showed up. White men who would have gone to fight. So I mention all this just to say that, Jordan, even though he was a slave, he was well aware. He would have been well aware. He would have been like 10 years old growing up, hearing these stories probably about men from Williamson County going to Texas and fighting. By the time 1861 rolls around, the Civil War breaks out, Jordan's 14 years old. First, other southern states break away, South Carolina and Louisiana. Tennessee is the last state to join the Confederacy. That happens in June of 1861. And we know that at that point, white men were forming militias, and they were taking black men with them as servants to take care of horses, to take care of themselves. We don't know if Jordan would have been taken. It's possible. Lots of young black boys and men were taken to serve the Confederacy. And often through that service, they learned about what military life was like. They understood rank and they understood companies and marching and things like that. So it's possible, but unfortunately, we just don't know if Jordan had that experience. In March of 1862, Middle Tennessee is occupied by federal forces. It's a strategic center for the United States to take Nashville back, to take Middle Tennessee back. This man on the left, this is General Gordon Granger. He is in Franklin. Franklin's the county seat of Williamson County. I suspect, I kind of know where Jordan would have lived. He would have been right outside of Franklin, most likely. There was a very large slave owner with the last name of Jordan outside of Franklin. So I suspect that that's where George had grown up. He would have known that this fort called Fort Granger was being built. He might have even participated in building it. Lots of black men and boys were serving United States forces during the war at this point. As the United States Army had arrived in Middle Tennessee, slavery started to fracture. It gave the opportunity for people to escape from the factories where they were working, the farms where they were working, and they flooded to places like Franklin and Nashville where U.S. troops were for jobs and protection. So it's possible that Jordan had that experience. In January 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was declared by Abraham Lincoln. And, most of you are teachers or docents, so you probably know that the freedom part of the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to Tennessee. It only applied to states that were still under Confederate control. So kind of didn't apply to anybody because the Confederates weren't going to follow Abraham Lincoln's proclamation. But the more important thing for Jordan's story is that in the fine print was a provision that said, I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable conditions, meaning black men and boys who were healthy, will be received into the armed service of the United States. And this was the legal foundation to allow black men to enlist in the United States Army and Navy. And then within 5 months, May of 1863, something called the United States Colored Troops was formed. These were all black regiments of privates, corporals, and sergeants with white officers. And I can't overestimate or explain how transformative and what a radical idea this was for the United States Army to be paying former slaves to carry guns, to wear uniforms, to be equipped and trained was just, it was transformative and transformative for the war. Part of it was they were taking these men away from the Confederacy. They are now no longer potential assets for the Confederacy, but now they're turning them onto their enemy. So the U.S. Colored Troops included infantry and artillery. This is the 2nd U.S. Colored Light Artillery. They were stationed in Nashville. And cavalry, which will become important, obviously, to sort of laying the groundwork for the Buffalo Soldiers. One interesting thing about the U.S. Colored Troops story is that 200,000 U.S. Colored Troops enlisted across the United States. Tennessee, which is down there with the Red Star, sent the 3rd largest number of black men to serve. So the U.S. Colored Troops story in Tennessee is really, really important and significant. We only sent less troops than Kentucky and Louisiana. So their contributions to the war were significant. When U.S. Colored Troops were being organized, Nashville was a major hub. Franklin was also a hub of enlisting. So again, Jordan would have 100% seen black men in blue uniforms. He would have seen troops. In fact, in March of 1864, the 17th U.S. Colored Infantry was garrisoned in Franklin. They were under the command of William Shatner, who later was in command of the 24th Infantry, which was a Buffalo unit. He was nicknamed Pecos Bill, which, that's that cartoon character was modeled on him. So Jordan would have absolutely seen black U.S. soldiers. during his teenage years. And in fact, he might have even been aware of the Medal of Honor because Black soldiers and sailors were issued the Medal of Honor during the Civil War. 16 Black men earned them in the United States Colored Troops, and 16 Black men who served in the Navy earned the Medal of Honor. So this wouldn't necessarily have been something he would not have heard about. In fact, several Medals of Honor were issued at the Battle of Nashville, which happened in late December of 1864. And in this painting, I don't know if you can see, but the blue uniforms, those are Black troops at the Battle of Nashville. They were instrumental to the United States winning the Battle of Nashville. And the Battle of Nashville was really significant because it was basically the end of the war in this part of the country. I realized a little too late, there's a typo in this slide. So it shouldn't say January 1866, it should say January 1865. So Battle of Nashville is in mid-December of 1864. Within weeks, pro-Unionists, mostly white pro-Unionists, are calling for a convention. They want Tennessee back in the Union. They're going to rewrite their constitution. They are making preparations. They are like, the war is over for us. And it was for Middle Tennessee. When they were putting together this convention to establish a new constitution for Tennessee, 59 Black men, most of whom were soldiers in the United States Colored Troops, wrote a petition. And I just want to read to you part. It's very long and it's very moving. It's on my blog, which you can find on my website. But this is what they said. They said, "But what higher order of citizen is there than the soldier? Or who has a greater trust confided in his hands? If we are called on to do military duty against the rebel armies in the field, why should we be denied the privilege of voting against rebel citizens at the ballot box? The latter is as necessary to save the government as the former." So very quickly, this idea of citizenship is directly tied to service. And so, like I said, Jordan would have been hearing about things like this. And when I was walking in today, I saw that one of the banners said courage and citizenship. And I feel like those are the two hallmarks of George Jordan's story, is to think about how his citizenship was framed by his service. So then the Civil War comes to an end that April. So Tennessee has already abolished slavery legally, has basically rejoined the Union. Andrew Johnson, who was the military general, he's now the president, and the war is over. But I should have said this, but when Black men were joining the United States Colored Troops, they enlisted for a 3-year term of service. So since the U.S. Colored Troops wasn't even established until May of 1863, when the war ends, they still have at least another year on their service. Some of them had 2 more years. So U.S. Colored Troop regiments were still on service, on duty throughout Tennessee into 1866. You could see there were companies in Chattanooga as late as April 30th, 1866. So a full year after the end of the Civil War. And one of the things that those soldiers were used for was they were being sent to Texas. And my reason for telling you all this is because I think this all laid the framework for Jordan's service. And he also could have been very aware that men were being used in this way. So 16,000 U.S. Colored Troops were sent to the border with Mexico. They were securing the war was over, and the federal government was like, okay, now we need to worry about having a peacetime service corps. On June 19th, 1865, General Granger, who, remember, he had been in Franklin, he had built the fort, he arrived in Galveston, Texas, and issued Order Number 1, which declared that slavery was now dead in Texas. And that is the genesis of the Juneteenth holiday. And U.S. Colored Troops were largely the troops that were there to secure that border with General Granger. So with that sort of background, I think it gives you a better understanding of the significance of what were called the Buffalo Soldier Regiments. So in July of 1866, while U.S. Colored Troops are down in Texas, Congress passes an act to increase and fix the military peace establishment of the United States. This is like, we need a standing army now that the war is over. and for the first time authorized regiments of black soldiers. So 2 black cavalry regiments, the 9th and the 10th, and 4 black infantry regiments. These were modeled just like the U.S. colored troops. You could only be a private, a corporal, or a sergeant if you were black, with very, very rare exceptions. And then all the upper level officers were all white. And I guess I should say, I don't know if everybody knows where the name Buffalo Soldier comes from, but when they were sent out west, primarily in the beginning to fight Native Americans and to push them onto reservations, the Native Americans referred to these black soldiers as buffalo because, they had dark hair and dark skin. They thought they looked like buffaloes, and they also said they fought like buffaloes. They were incredibly tenacious and courageous, and so that is where that sort of nickname Buffalo Soldiers came from. And when I was looking through old newspapers trying to find references, the first reference I found to them being called Buffalo Soldiers was in 1871, so 5 years into this. Well, in 1866, right before Christmas of 1866, George Jordan goes to Nashville, and he enlists into the 38th U.S. Colored Infantry for a term of 3 years, just like, the U.S. Colored Troop soldiers would have enlisted. This is a newspaper article that I found from a Nashville newspaper talking about how they were hoping to raise 500 men to join the 38th Infantry. They were put onto, and Jordan would have been put onto a steamboat like the one down here on the right. They would have gone up the Cumberland River to the Tennessee, to the Mississippi, and then on up to St. Louis, where they would have been taken to the Jefferson Barracks. So he would have been 18 or 19 years old when this happened. And like I said, we don't really know much about his early life, but we do know that 6 men with the same last name, 6 Jordans, enlisted in the United States Colored Troops. They ranged in age. Their birth dates were from 1824 to 1844. He was born in 1847, so they were all been a little bit older than him. 2 of them served in the 17th U.S. Colored Infantry under William Shatner, Pecos Bill. And then 15 so far, I'm still working on the research, which is tedious and time consuming, but I have found 15 Buffalo Soldiers from Williamson County. One of them was this man, Private Felix Battle. We have very few photographs, so we're lucky to have a photograph of him and of George Jordan. He actually served as a drummer boy in the 13th. So even though I said George Jordan was too young, Felix Battle is the exception to that rule. He enlisted when he was 13 and served as a Buffalo Soldier. He served at the Battle of Nashville. He had seen a lot of service. So he and Jordan enlisted in the 38th together in Nashville. And this woman also enlisted in the 38th. I don't know if anyone's ever heard her story. Her name was Kathy Williams. She enlisted as William Kathy. She hid her gender, and she served for 2 years before she got sick and was taken to the hospital, and they discovered that she was a woman, and she was honorably discharged because she had been a good soldier. So Jordan and Felix Battle would have served with her for his first few years of service, which I just thought I'd mention because I think that's an interesting story. So pretty quickly during the 38th time, they were starting to consolidate these regiments. The 38th got folded into the 41st in March of 1869, and then by December of 1869, it got rolled into the 24th Infantry. So Jordan is in Company D of the 24th Infantry in December of 1869. And remember, he enlisted in December 23rd of 1866. So his 3-year anniversary is December 23rd, 1869. So he is discharged. The 24th is at Fort Davis in Texas. He's discharged on that anniversary. And then like a week later, he re-enlists, but he's like, I want to be in the cavalry. So he switches and he enlists in Troop K of the 9th Cavalry, which he would serve in for the next 27 years. So this is now his home in the military. Just to place this in some context. So during this time, between when he enlists and now when he is enlisting into the cavalry in 1870, the Civil Rights Amendments to the Constitution have been adopted. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to former slaves, guaranteed due process of law and equal protection. And then the 15th guaranteed the right to vote. So I just want you to have like that in your head. Like by now, he is not just a soldier in the cavalry, he has these legal protections due to him by the Constitution. So yeah, I mean, they were still, due process still applied to women. It was just the right to vote that was distinguished. Now, I would say I don't think it was equally carried out towards women, but the idea of due process applying to people who were born in the United States, which is what that was based on, would have applied equally. So for the 1870s, he grows from a 23-year-old young man to a 33-year-old seasoned soldier. He is serving in the 9th Cavalry in Texas and New Mexico, Colorado, and he rises in the ranks from corporal to sergeant. So they start out, this is Fort Davis in Texas. It's a state park today, so this is very much what it would have looked like when Jordan was there. They would have had these little adobe barracks, and there was probably like the officers' offices. This is Company I of the 9th Cavalry. So this was at Fort Davis. You could see the hills in the background. This is what Troop K would have looked a lot like during this time period. It is, when you start really reading their stories, it is amazing how isolated they were. The closest train stop was 600 miles away. They had to be entirely self-sufficient. They needed to build their barracks. They needed to take care of their cattle. They needed to have gardens. They were collecting water. They were making little adobe bricks to make those barracks. They were just incredibly isolated and cut off during that time period. In 1870, the first Black soldier in the post-Civil War time period is awarded a Medal of Honor, and he was in the 9th Cavalry. So again, Jordan, he knows about this medal. He would have been probably inspired by his comrades' service. In 1874, he's promoted to corporal, and then in September of 1875, they're transferred to New Mexico, and this is when they first start really having significant and regular interactions with Native Americans. They were engaged in Apache fightings with the Apache. They were providing protection. The federal government was really trying to get settlers, mostly white settlers, out west. They wanted to claim and establish this land. So they were providing escorts for them. And they were also doing things like stringing telegraph lines, because even if you were 600 miles from a train, if you could at least have a telegraph line, that would help. So they were doing sort of infrastructure work like that. And then I know this is really fuzzy. This is the best I could do with this picture, but this is a picture of a group from the 9th Cavalry escorting some white settlers and a stagecoach headed out west. So this is the kind of work that they were doing during this time period. And I just want to take a minute, because I do think we need to acknowledge that, a lot of what they were doing was killing Native people. And looking back on it today, we can sort of understand, the not great parts of that history. But at the time, Jordan was following a legal order. This was the policy of the government, and he was fulfilling that. And also to remember that the majority of the soldiers out west engaged in these Indian campaigns were white, even though, the Buffalo Soldiers sort of have that story attached to them. They were only like 10 to 20% of the soldiers out west engaged in the Indian wars during this time. And I think it's also sort of worth thinking about, just in Jordan's own mind and his comrades' minds. Like, he had gone from being a victim of an American policy, slavery was legal. He could have been sold as a child. His parents could have been sold. Like, his life had been very difficult under a legal policy. And now he was sort of on the flip side of that as a perpetuator of another policy that, some might say was not moral, but was legal at the time. So anyway, I did want to sort of address that kind of tension in his story. By July of 1879, Jordan was out in Fort Garland, Colorado. This is a picture on the right of Fort Garland's front gates being guarded by some some Buffalo soldiers. This is a picture of another corporal in the 9th Cavalry in the snow. So it gives you a sense of like what clothes he might have been wearing and how his horse would have been maybe equipped. I will say, we have horses. That horse does not look super happy, but they had a tough life too, along with the Buffalo Soldiers. Then in 1879, he's appointed sergeant. So one thing we know is that he would have had to be literate to be a sergeant. So somewhere along the way, he has now learned to read and write, and he would have been considered a leader by his commanding officers. He would not have been promoted to sergeant if they didn't see leadership qualities in him. By the 1880s, he's now going to go from 33 to 43 years old. This is the most intense period of the Indian Wars and the fighting that he and the 9th Cavalry would see. And then by the end of the 1880s, they end up at Fort Robinson in Nebraska, which will be the home really for his home base for the rest of his life. In February of 1880, this is Colonel Edward Hatch. He's the commanding officer of the 9th Cavalry. And if anybody enjoys Hatch green chilies, ever heard of that? That's what these are named for him. There's a town called Hatch, which was named for Colonel Hatch, and then the chilies come from the town Hatch in New Mexico. The 9th Cavalry is in Ojo Caliente in New Mexico, and Hatch issues Field Order Number 1, which says that he is determined to bring the Apache War to a speedy and definite conclusion. He's tired of these like cat and mouse games, and he is going to bring it to an end. And I do think that in his mind, he knew that the United States was going to win this war eventually. There's no way the Native people were going to be able to beat the United States Army. And dragging it out was just going to lead to more deaths. And so I think he was like, let's just get this over with. I'm tired of my soldiers dying. The Native people keep dying. They're eventually going to get forced onto these reservations or they're going to die. And so he was like, I'm tired of this and we're going to get through this. And I should also mention that Hatch had been in the United States Army during the Civil War. He was in charge of the cavalry in Tennessee. So another Tennessee connection to this story. In May of 1880, Jordan and a small group of his soldiers, because now he's in a leadership position, are engaged in the first interaction that will earn him his Medal of Honor. And there's Fort Tularosa in New Mexico. Calling it a fort is a gross exaggeration. It was one small adobe building, and there were no soldiers stationed there at the time. Jordan and his men received word that a band of Apache warriors under Victorio are going to attack. And one thing that I think is just kind of interesting to note during this is that all the descriptions of this time period talk about them marching. So I don't know if they were not on horseback at this time period, but I just want to mention that. They talk about how they had been marching all day. They get word that Fort Tularosa and the settlers that are right around it are immediately in imminent danger. And so he polls his group of men. I think he has like 19 men with him, and he says, we're going to have to like double time march all night long. I know we've been marching all day. We're going to have to stay up and march all night. And to a man, they said, let's go. So they march all night. They arrive at the fort in the morning of the 14th. And luckily, everything's still calm and they have not been attacked. And this is where you can see Jordan's real leadership abilities. He takes control. He starts having them collect material to build like a barrier. He gets all the settlers organized. He has his men start sleeping in shifts so that they can get a little bit of rest. And later that day, it says on the evening, hold on, I can read it easier on here. On the evening of the 14th, while I was standing outside the fort, conversing with one of the citizens, the Indians came upon us unexpectedly and attacked. So this is Victorio. One of the things that people talk about Jordan's abilities in this fight was his ability to to keep everybody calm. Don't fight, don't use all your ammunition. So they were very deliberate about it, sort of the don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes. Like, we are not going to go crazy here. He got everybody organized. The Apache were trying to steal the settlers' cattle. He sent men out to bring the cattle back in. And in the end, and this was very rare in fighting Victorio, no Buffalo soldiers had died, but there were casualties on Victorio's side. And this is kind of the beginning of Victorio really starting to run into trouble with the Buffalo soldiers. So he is quoted as saying, "The whole action was short but exciting while it lasted, and after it was all over, the townspeople congratulated us for having repulsed a band of more than 100 attackers." So again, it was like 20 to 100. So it is pretty remarkable that they were able to hold them off. Over the next year, Victorio is killed in Mexico by Mexican soldiers, and this man, whose name is Nana, takes over. He was Victorio's lieutenant, but he was like 20 years older than him. He's like 80 years old when this ambush happens at Carrizo Canyon, which is just incredible to me to think about. So again, the 9th Cavalry, a small group of them are out. They are tracking Nana, and he's pretty wily. Like, he is 80 years old. He knows every crook and crevice of New Mexico, and he leads them into a canyon. And my husband loves Westerns, and I swear every time I walk in and he has a Western on, there's people walking into a canyon getting fired on from above by Apaches, or, that's exactly what happened. They walk into the canyon, and before they realize what's happened, they're being fired on from above. So Jordan and another soldier in the 9th are sent up, one on one side, one on the other, with a small group of men to try to provide cover to let the rest of the cavalry out, to give them cover to get out. They were pinned down. They were being shot at by Nana's men, and it sounds like it was really, really touch and go for a long time. Again, Jordan's leadership in telling his men, don't panic, be careful, don't use up your ammunition, and they managed to save the rest of the K troop that was down in this canyon. Jordan said, he was described by his captain at the time, he said that he stubbornly held his ground in an extremely exposed position and gallantly forced back a much superior number of the enemy, preventing them from surrounding the command. So in both situations, you can see how his leadership ability helps him. He's not ever really on the attack. He's protecting people. He's protecting the settlers at Fort Tularosa. He's protecting his comrades in this canyon. So this is his citation, and you can see it talks about both Fort Tularosa and Carrizo Canyon, which was very rare for somebody to have 2 citations related to his medal. But I think, like Scott said, he only got 1 medal. He got 2 citations, which is very rare, and only 1 medal. And then he was also awarded the Certificate of Merit for his service at Carrizo Canyon. This is Thomas Shaw. Remember how I said that another member had gone up on one side of the canyon? Thomas Shaw was also a sergeant. He had gone up on the opposite side, and they were both awarded the Medal of Honor for that day. So I was telling Scott, I think he might be in the picture, but he might not have been issued his medal yet, because I don't think there's anybody else that looks like him that's in that picture. And he is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And let me read you this. So this was his citation, which I think is interesting because it's so similar to Jordan's. It was that he forced the enemy back after stubbornly holding his ground in an extremely exposed position and prevented the enemy's superior numbers from surrounding his command. So you could see that, that's very similar to what they said about Jordan. By 1885, the 9th Cavalry has made Fort Robinson, Nebraska, their home base. And like I said, this is where they will be for really the next 15 years or so. They're on the very far west side of Nebraska. Jordan was commended during his time there for more bravery. He was helping to catch an escaped prisoner. But at this point, he's already has a Medal of Honor and a Certificate of Merit. So I don't think there's anything else to give him for that. For the first time, would have seen a higher ranking Black officer. This is Charles Young. He would eventually be a colonel in the United States Army. He had gone to West Point. Finally, you're starting to see this glass ceiling that has been there, keeping them from moving up the ranks. So Charles Young was out at Fort Robinson during this time period. So I just think that must have been pretty amazing. In the 1890s, he goes from being 43 to 53 years old. And this is honestly probably my favorite part of his life. The Indian Wars are basically over at this point. This aggressive campaign has brought the fighting to an end. The Buffalo Soldiers start to focus more on things like working in the national parks. They're considered to be the first national park rangers. In May of 1890, almost exactly 10 years after his first gallant effort, he is awarded his Medal of Honor. Again, there it is. I think it is interesting. I know that today when we think about seeing someone receive their Medal of Honor, it's like at the White House, the president does it. He would have received his in Nebraska at Fort Robinson. So probably his commanding officer would have been responsible for doing that. And it's also interesting that in this picture, so in the back row, you can see Johnson. That's Henry Johnson. He also received a Medal of Honor. And then this right here, holding the flag, that very tall man, I think that might be Shaw. I think that might be the other man because he was said to be very tall and he has very similar beard. But Jordan received his medal on May 7th, 1890. Johnson got his on September 22nd. They're both wearing it in this picture. So I think the picture was taken sometime after September 22nd, 1890. And just to put their accomplishments into context, so only 18 Buffalo Soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor. 3 might be in this picture. At least 2 certainly are. 15 of the Medal of Honors went to the 9th Cavalry. And 9 of those 15 were black soldiers because their white officers were also eligible for it. And then only 12 certificates of merit were given to Buffalo Soldiers. So for Jordan to have earned both the certificate of merit and the Medal of Honor, like it was very rare and really extraordinary and really showed, I think, the high regard in which his commanding officers held him, because there's no way that his Medal of Honor would have been elevated and pushed through. It took 10 years for him to get it. And in 1891, this is my favorite period of his life. K-Troop. So K-Troop's just one company of the 9th. They get sent to Fort Lewis in Washington, D.C. So if you've ever seen on TV, President Kennedy's funeral with the caisson, this is where they are. They are stationed there. They're sent for 3 years to Washington, D.C. as a sort of a reward for all their hard work that they had done. They are considered to be sort of the Army's best cavalrymen, and they performed ceremonial duties. They would have been President Garfield's escort at different events. And when Garfield was inaugurated the second time, they were in his inaugural parade. And then these are just some of the newspaper articles that I found of that time, talking about they were the best riders in the world. They talked about, oh, never mind. See, there I am, like trying to tap my head and rub my stomach. This picture, no one's totally sure, but people do think this might be a K-Troop 9th Cavalry soldier at Fort Lewis in Washington, D.C., based on the building and the time period. The newspaper articles at the time talked about how the black residents of Washington, D.C. would come out at night to watch them practice and perform. And what a point of pride it was for them. Because this is like the late 1800s at this point, to see themselves represented by these soldiers. I just want to read, this is from the Washington Post. This is June of 1891. Troop K is a remarkable one, and its history is one to be proud of. The first 20 men, so the top 20 on the roster, average 25 years of service, and many of them will soon reach the retiring limit, 30 years of service, including Jordan. 3 of the men wear medals of honor. So that would be Jordan, Johnson, and Shaw. Many of them served during the war and have been constantly on the frontier since. So that was just a little snippet from an article about the men and like what high regard they were held in. They go back to Fort Robinson. He, again, hits his 5-year limit. He's discharged on January 2nd. He reenlists on January 3rd. And you can see here on the left, it says excellent. So they would have to make a notation about his character. So his commanding officer said that he was an excellent sergeant. He was an excellent soldier. I think this is just fun. While he is there at Fort Robinson during what would be his last hurrah in the United States Army, the 24th Infantry, which he was in for like 3 months early in his career, they are doing this experiment with a bicycle corps. Bicycles were the rage in America at that time, and they equipped them, and they rode all the way across the United States in these bicycles from Kansas all the way to California. And on July 4th, 1896, the 24th Infantry Bicycle Corps stopped, and certainly Jordan would have gone out to see that. And then he, when he's 50 years old, on March 2nd, 1897, he writes a letter to Washington requesting his retirement. He's been in the service for 30 years. These on the left, I don't know if you can see it that well, but this is what's called like his descriptive book, and it describes him. It says he wasn't that tall. He was like 5'5", so shorter than me. It says that he was born in Williamson County, and it sort of would outline his service and that he was eligible for an honorable discharge. On the left is his whole description of all his enlistments and discharges, like successively over the years. And on the right, it says that he'll be eligible for $7 a month pay as a retired soldier. So this wasn't like a pension. This was like his retirement pay. And that he got a $2 a month bump for the Certificate of Merit. And I sometimes wonder if his commanding officers, who clearly thought highly of him, would have pushed for that Certificate of Merit in order to kind of take care of him later down the road. He retired in Crawford, Nebraska, which was the town right next door to Fort Robinson. This is a photograph of it from that time. Looks just like you would kind of imagine. The next year, while he's retired, the Spanish-American War breaks out, and his former comrades from the 9th go off charging up San Juan Hill with Teddy Roosevelt, which is kind of amazing. I can just imagine him back home in Crawford sort of waiting for the newspapers and cheering them on. And they were really getting sort of national attention at this point. 1900, he's now, in his 50s, which today isn't that old, I like to think, but, back then he was older. He appears only the second time in a federal census. I found him in the 1870 census when he was at Fort Davis, and then I found him in 1900, but the 1890 census was burned, so I didn't expect to find him, but I can't find him in the 1880 census, which makes sense because they were out in the middle of nowhere, and I bet they just weren't counted in the census that year. But you can see it says Jordan George, and then he's living with a woman named Bertie Taylor, who's listed as his servant, and a man named William Boone. And so I was very curious about them. It turned out that Boone had also left the 9th Cavalry, but he was younger. He'd only served like 5 years. He's renting from them. And William and Bertie got married just a couple months after the census was taken. So I think they were all just kind of living there together. That same year, a presidential election is going on, and it's William McKinley with Teddy Roosevelt as his VP is running against William Jennings Bryan, who's known from the Scopes monkey trial. And Jennings is from Nebraska. I think it's interesting. This awful political cartoon appeared in the Crawford Tribune. This is in his little teeny tiny town newspaper article. And I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's showing it says the Negro disenfranchised, the first step into a new slavery. And then at the bottom, it says Senator Tillman in Congress, quote, "We do our best to keep every Negro in our state from voting." So Tillman was a avowed white supremacist from South Carolina. And I don't really know why this little town in Nebraska decided to post this article. I don't know if it was a warning, like this is happening, keep your eyes open. I don't know if it was a threat, but I found this piece of paper in his file. I think this is so interesting. So October 1st, 1900, the election's going to be in November. Jordan, and this is his handwriting and his signature, writes a letter to Washington, and he says, Dear sir, will you kindly inform me whether a retired soldier living at this place, holding property and paying taxes on same, has the right to vote? Respectfully yours, George Jordan, First Sergeant, retired. And he gets a response. And it says, replying to your letter, There appears to be no legal prohibition in the state of Nebraska. However, it's under the control of your local authorities, to whom we suggest you apply. So this is the time when poll taxes were preventing people from voting, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, all sorts of things were being used by local authorities to prevent African Americans from voting. And I have talked to the officials in Crawford, Nebraska, so many times that they are tired of hearing from me. They cannot find the voting rolls, so we don't know if he did vote. But I missed that part. I did find this November 2nd, which is right after he would have gotten his reply, that says retired soldiers residing in Crawford precinct have a right to vote here. But I will say that Crawford and Fort Robinson was the hub of the 9th Cavalry. The majority of the soldiers there were Black, and almost all of the retired soldiers in Crawford were Black. I only know this because I went through the 1900 census looking for them. Yeah, so he was quite literate. And the way he wrote the letter was beautiful. Like, it was very well, because I've read other letters of African Americans from this time period who didn't have the same education that he obviously received, and they are much more rudimentary, white and Black at this time period. So in 1904, he is diagnosed with kidney disease, and several accounts state that he was denied admission to the Fort Robinson Hospital, which again, I'm just so dismayed by, because like I said, this was the hospital treating the 9th Cavalry. Like, there were Black soldiers in that hospital. So for him to have been turned away as a Medal of Honor recipient, as a former first sergeant, is just so, it's just appalling. This actually on the left is a letter from his doctor where he tried twice to get him admitted. And in fact, when the hospital was rebuked by the Surgeon General for their action toward Jordan, and it was the beginning of changing policy toward Black soldiers, particularly the retired soldiers, and the way that they were treated by these post hospitals. He died on October 19th, 1904. I just managed to find his obituary, which appeared in the Crawford Tribune. It described how he had been sick, and it said that on retiring from the Army, his officers and comrades, as a token of esteem for faithful duties performed, he was presented with a fine gold-headed ebony cane, which he had a right and certainly did prize very highly. And he was buried at the Fort Robinson Post Cemetery. And this is a historic marker, and they kind of noted the most significant burials, and his burial is noted on there. Years later, Fort Robinson was closed, and so his body was exhumed and reinterred at another national cemetery in Nebraska. And you can see it says George Jordan, Medal of Honor, First Sergeant, U.S. Army, Indian Wars. And then on the right, it shows that he was from Tennessee. So quickly, I know I'm like over time, but quickly, I just want to say, so one of the big questions about him was always, where is his medal? He never married. He never had children that anybody knows of. When he died, Bertie and William had moved out. They were married, and so he was all by himself. So the story is that his friends packed up all his belongings, including, I guess, that ebony cane and his certificate of merit and his medal, put it in a barrel, turned it over to the Fort Robinson officials. They held on to it for several years. No one claimed it, and it was auctioned off. And a widow bought it for $1. She held on to it. She had 2 daughters who never married. Eventually it passed to them, and then it went to their caregiver, who was a woman named Janet Mize, and she eventually moved to Arkansas. And when she was living in Arkansas, a woman who was a historian realized that the Christmas tree ornament on the family tree was actually a Medal of Honor. And like I said, when you turn it over on the back, it has the description. So she started Googling, and this man up here, this is Ed Hooper. He's a journalist in Knoxville, Tennessee. He has been obsessed with George's story for years. And he had, whenever he had the opportunity, he would post about the story. And she found him. And the medal has been sent to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., where it's on display. So let me just, I know I'm over time, but quickly, I just want to say that during World War II, Black soldiers were being trained at a base in Seattle, Washington. I don't know if you can see it here, but it was called Camp George Jordan. It was named for him. They understood the importance of representation, showing these Black soldiers the history they had come from of being brave soldiers. This is a dance that was held at Camp Jordan. And then in 1998 in Williamson County, finally back at home, people were starting to recognize his service. And a Veterans Park was established largely due to an effort to try to acknowledge George Jordan. And you can, just like you can here, you can buy brick pavers. And his paver, you can see, is the largest and the only square paver, and it's right in the middle. And then in 2018, a group of students to the teachers started advocating for the next elementary school to be named after George Jordan. And so they appeared for months before the school board advocating for this to happen. And so now we have Jordan Elementary. And then obviously the other part of his legacy is his exhibit here. So I know there's an effort, a hope to get his medal here. So if you have students who are looking for a little project, I think that would be a great one. Start a little letter writing campaign to the Smithsonian to ask that the medal be returned, at least loaned to Tennessee and to this museum.